If you're interested in improvisation in your live sets, then this video is for you. I'm going to show you how I set up my gear to play live in a way that I find inspiring and interesting and creative and spontaneous. So now let's get into it. So I put out a live jam video that I'll link up here and I'll put the link in the description. And a bunch of you asked how I set that up so that I could improvise like I was doing in the jam video and without having it sound like a total sonic train wreck. This video is in response to that. It's going to show you how I do it, and this is by no means the only way to do it. It's just a way to do it that works for me and that I find really interesting and fun to be able to play with live. In this setup, we actually have two independent signal paths. There's the audio path, and then there is the MIDI path, and they can actually go into different places at different times, different directions, and it's really important to get that idea clear first. So basically so the audio signal comes out of the Digitone stereo into the A and B inputs of the Octatrack. Then we have a mono out coming out of the Minitaur into the C input of the Octatrack. Those signals can be processed on different channels within the Octatrack and then summed together, and then they are put out through a left and right stereo pair out to the recorder. Next we have the MIDI signal path, which comes out of the Octatrack. So the Octatrack is the MIDI clock, and it's the kind of start of the chain that goes into the Digitone, and then from the through port of the Digitone we come out and go into the Minitaur. And so that allows the Octatrack to control both the Digitone and the Minitaur, and nothing that's done within the Digitone affects the Minitaur because it's coming from a through and not an out. So the signal is passing through unaffected from the Octatrack to the Minitaur. It's key to remember that these two signal paths are independent of one another, and you'll see why in just a minute. So first we can talk about the audio routing within the Octatrack. So the signal from the Digitone is on a through machine in track 1, audio track 1. Audio track 2 is a neighbor machine, and for those of you unfamiliar with the Octatrack, that allows you to have the same signal affected by both channels. So it comes through one into the other and then out, and that allows you to have, because within the Octatrack you can only have 2 effects per channel, and this allows you to actually have 4 effects on those inputs. Input is coming from A and B, which is the audio inputs that are coming from the Digitone. Then we have on track 3, the input is coming from C, which is the Minitaur, and then track 4 is the neighbor to that, so that allows 4 effects on the bass and 4 effects on the melodic ones, the melodic channel as well. Track 5 is a sample audio channel, and that has hi-hats on it. Track 6 is another sample playing channel, flex channel, and that is playing just a looping drone, like a repeating quick sound that was turned into a drone with some effects. Audio track 7 is kick drum, and then track number 8 is set up within this setup to be a master. And what that means is that all of these different channels, so the audio signal coming from the Digitone will go into one, through channel 2, so that you've got both effects, and then it goes actually to channel 8, where you can add additional global effects on the entire mix, whether that's a compressor or filter or reverb or delays or whatever you want to add on there. You can have 2 effects on that channel, which would then be global to everything coming into it, and then that gets sent out through the main outputs. Next up, talk about the MIDI channels. So as I said, the audio and the MIDI signals are separate. They're separate going out, and they're also separate as they're processed back through the Octatrack. So we've got 8 MIDI channels that can all be sending signals to different places as well. So for example, the way this is set up, I have on MIDI channel 1, it's sequencing track 4 in the Digitone. MIDI channel 2 is sequencing track 2 in the Digitone. MIDI channel 3 is sequencing track 3 in the Digitone. MIDI channel 4 is sequencing the Minitaur. So each one of those is going out to different things. Now we also have a sequencer in the Digitone, and I'll talk about how we use that in parallel with the sequencer in the Octatrack in just a minute. So as far as sound selection goes for this, we have a couple of different main sounds. First of all, we have the bass sound, which is coming from the Minitaur. It's important when we're selecting sounds for a mix like this that we're going to be using for performance to have the end performance in mind when we're selecting the sound. So I selected the Minitaur and the way that it's set up here as a sound that has a lot of harmonics in it, because I knew I was going to be doing some improvised filter sweeps and things like that, and I wanted to be able to have a whole bunch of harmonics that will make it to make those filter sweeps a little bit more impactful. So you'll notice as you open and close that, you get some of those harmonics, and it's really important to keep those things in mind as we're selecting sounds for a live performance. Next, we have on track 6 the drone sound, which I mentioned before, and that's just way back in the background to add some atmosphere. Then we have some hi-hats. And again, keeping in mind the frequency range, we want those in a frequency that's not going to clash with other things, because we're not EQing this and mixing this down. We're playing this live, so we want to make sure the instruments themselves fit into the mix just the way that they are straight out of the box. Then we have our kick. And again, something with a little bit of a boom, but what was really important to me with this, because I have a lot of kind of long drawn out sounds, is I wanted something that had a really impactful transient at the beginning of it, so it would really kind of punch through the mix once all the sounds are in together. Next up, we have this track 1 and 2 here, which is the through track of the neighbor coming from the Digitone, and that's kind of the melodic side of things. And we'll talk about how that's actually 2 parts in just a minute. Track 1, then we have track 2. And track 2 is, you'll notice, a poly. So that's repeating every 12 steps rather than every 16 steps. So it'll kind of phase in and out of sync with everything else that's going on. If you're interested in the difference between Polymeter and Polyrhythm, Andrew Wong did a great video about that, and I'll actually link that down in the description. And it does a really good job of explaining the difference between a polyrhythm and a polymeter. Those two terms get confused a lot and get used interchangeably, but they are in fact 2 separate things, and he does the best job I've seen of explaining it. We have another melodic sequence coming from the Digitone, and that's something that we use in the break. That's a different type of melody, something that's a little bit smoother and a little bit more mellow. So something that's important with all of those melodic choices that we made, I wanted things that had a nice pluck to the beginning of them in each one of the sounds, so that they would also kind of cut through the mix of droney sounds and reverbs that we had going on, but also things where we could open up the decays on them for different moments when we wanted to change things. So sound selection is really important when you're doing a live set. So next we'll talk about sequencing. We have a few different things sequenced here. We have our bass part. As you can see, is a pretty simple bass part, because what we wanted to have was the ability to be able to use the filters, lengthen decays, and things like that within the bass line. One of the more interesting and actually really important parts of this whole live performance is the melody line that seems to start together and then split into 2 different melody lines and then come back together and kind of play around with one another. And that's achieved using parallel sequencing. So we basically have MIDI channel 4 here sending to channel 4 on the Digitone. We have on channel 4 on the Digitone also the sequencer from the Digitone sequencing different patterns. So we in effect have 2 different sequencers telling the same channel and the same synth to play notes and to play different notes at different times. Now, in order to make these different melodies kind of play around and be able to be improvised and played live without sounding like a train wreck, it's important that a couple things happen, that they are in key at the beginning and that we find ways to keep them in key. So for example, all of these tones that are on the Digitakt, if you notice here, they're all being played on a C. I did this recording in C minor. So we have the root note of C playing all of these notes on the Digitone. So it's not straying from that. It's staying in the root note. It's playing C5 the whole time. And then we have in the Octatrack a root note of C as well. But then if you go into the amp, and actually if you double click that, you get to the arpeggiator setup. You can actually set the key within the arpeggiator so that the arpeggiator will always play notes within that key. And what that does is it makes it so that any adjustments that you make on this that are adjusted kind of to automatic note settings will always be within that key of C minor, or you can adjust it. You can make the key whatever you want. If you want it to be F sharp major, you can do that. But I wanted this one to be in C minor. So we started off with this in C minor and this in C. What that does is it makes it so that when this note sequence is played, the Octatrack actually thinks that this note sequence is an arpeggio that is in C, C minor. So each of these notes is set to C, set to the root note. So when I actually play this sequence, and then I go into the transpose, I can change these notes. And each number within the transpose is a semitone. So for every 12 semitones you go up, you're going up an octave. So if I was to start off on 12, it means that's kind of my root note. If I go up to 24, I'm an octave up on C as well. If I go up to 36, I'm an octave up on C as well. If I go up to 48, it's another C. But all the notes in between, because of that key that was set in the arpeggiator, it skips over notes that aren't part of the scale, and then it'll just change to the next note within the scale when you get to it. So for example, if 12 is our root note, and we go up to 17, that's up a fifth. If we go up to 19, that's up a seventh. Now what's interesting is that's what these notes are telling track 4 on the Digitone to do. However, track 4 on the Digitone has other notes that are staying on C that this sequencer is telling it to do. So if we unmute those and just play those notes, see, this is playing through a different sequence that's always staying on C. So this is telling it to play these notes on C. This is telling it to play these notes on C until they're being transposed. So these notes will move away from that root while these notes stay on the root. So if you play the two together with these ones starting on the same root note that this one is on, everything that you're hearing now is both sequences together, all played on that same C5. But when we start to move these ones away with this transpose key or transpose encoder, so these are all staying in the same C5 root, and these ones are now moving away using the transpose encoder. So it's a way to be able to use a static sequence, but have it be moving in an improvised way while you're performing. The next sequence part on here is the part that I was mentioning before that is a polymeter, meaning that it is not playing in the same meter as the 16-beat repeating sequence that we have in everything else within this sequence. So this track, track 2, Midi track 2, is actually 12 beats long rather than 16 beats long, and it has a single note on the 4th beat of those 12, and it sounds like this. If you listen to that with the kick, so what happens when you add in something that is a polymeter like that, it can help you add tension, and it can add interest, and it can add things that change all the way through without you having to actually make those changes, because that note is repeating every 12 beats. And when you're going through a kind of 4 on the floor pattern that is 16 beats long, it's not going to always line up with the same spot each time through with the other elements. It's going to push and pull all the way through the sequence. And the last section of the sequencing is going to be the melodic part that I used in the breakdown, that is a bit more of a melodic, little kind of happier sounding, just to add to the breakdown before things kind of drop back into the main part of the track. And it sounds a bit like this. And if you're following along with the sequencer down here below, you'll notice that not every note is playing every time. This is only 16 beats long, but there's a lot of variation in it. I use some different probabilities on each one of these steps. So some of them are playing, 35% of the time. Some of them are playing 70% of the time. So they don't play, it's not always the same pattern. So you can have a pattern that's relatively short, but that changes throughout the entire length of a track. So now I just wanted to talk about a couple of the ways that I use some of those things that we set up in the performance. So the first thing we're going to do at the beginning of a track is to try and kind of build things up from the start. So we're going to start with certain sounds, the volume all the way down. Maybe we'll just start off with just the bass and no kick, no hi-hats, no nothing. And we can even start with the bass filtered way down, even with the decay really short. And then to add some tension and energy, we can open up the decay and the cutoff a bit and bring it back down. And then maybe we want to add in part of the melodic. And we can even start to add a little bit more interest by playing around then with that transpose. And we can play around with some melodic things, kind of keeping it in a lower register. And because we have effects on our channel number 8 here, we can add in some crossfade effects. And use that as a way to bring in drums. And maybe the drone in the background. We can bring those drums in and out and use the crossfader. For some little mini breaks. And then we can go back and start messing around with our transpose. do something a bit more of a breakdown, we can maybe take out our kick, take out our kick, take out our hat. And then we can bring in our break melodic element, maybe using the effect. Build the tension a little bit using our polymeter. And then bring back in our kick. So you can see that we can use all the different pieces and parts that we put together in different ways. We've got a bass line that has some harmonics in it so that we can use the filter cutoff and the decay to add some interest. We can add tension through adding in things like our polymeter, through changing out the register that we transpose part of our melodic line into. We can add effects that open things up more and close things down. So it's a very simple pattern that you can do a lot of different things with. And I think if you plan out your pattern from the start, it gives you a lot of options when it comes time to perform. So if you'd like to check out the full track that we went over here, I will link that down in the description, and there's also a link up here above, and you can see all of these tips and tricks that we talked about here in action in a live performance. And if you got something out of this video, I'd really appreciate it if you'd hit the like button down below. It really helps with the channel, and it helps with how YouTube sees things, and I really love doing this, and I'd like to keep going with it. So the more we can help the channel grow, I really appreciate it. Also, if you're interested in synths, drum machines, music production, DJ gigs and sets, music industry insights, and things like that, please consider subscribing to the channel. And if you click the notification bell, it'll let you know each time I post a new video. Thanks so much for spending your time here, and I hope to see you in the next video. Cheers.